He was born into the gritty streets of Brooklyn and made his way through a life that few would choose, and fewer could endure. Paul Vario entered the world on July 10, 1914, in New York City, in the borough of Brooklyn. From the outset, his environment offered little in the way of comfort or ease, only the stark realities of street life in early 20th century New York. At an early age he was caught up in the world of truancy, petty crime, and juvenile detention. At 11 years old he was sentenced to 7 months in juvenile detention for truancy. This early episode may have been a minor detour, but it marked the beginning of a path from which there would be no easy return. As he matured, Vario moved from small-time delinquency to the more structured, and far more dangerous, world of organized crime. He aligned himself with the powerful Lucchese crime family, one of New York's infamous five families, and eventually rose through the ranks to become a made man, then a capo, in charge of his own crew operating out of the Brooklyn neighborhood of East New York and the surrounding areas. From behind the scenes, he managed a spectrum of illegal enterprises: loan sharking, gambling, fencing stolen goods, hijacking, extortion. He ran his day-to-day operations with a caution born of experience. A famously repeated rule of his was, never put your name on anything. He refused to own a phone, he avoided large gatherings when possible. He believed in the virtue of invisibility. Though the public image of a gangster often evokes the glamorous suits, the expensive cars and the loud bravado, Vario's personal style was more subtle but no less ruthless. He controlled territory, influence, unions, and workers, especially around the proximity of John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, where cargo haulers, freight handlers and airline staff became part of his network of extortion and influence. Through his people he threatened work stoppage, manipulated labor contracts, and exacted payment from companies that wished to avoid trouble. One of the enduring legends attached to Paul Vario concerns his temper, which, by several accounts, was legendary. One such incident: he and his wife, Phyllis, were dining in a restaurant when the maitre d' accidentally spilled wine on her dress. According to former associate Henry Hill, not only did Vario erupt but later that night he dispatched cars with men armed with baseball bats and pipes to assault the staff after closing time. The story encapsulates his mindset: a small insult could trigger wide retribution, because in his world respect was enforced, not offered. His business ventures were a mix of legitimate fronts and shadow operations. One business name under his control was Vario's Bargain Auto Parts Inc., located at 5700 2nd Avenue D in Canarsie. Behind its doors, his criminal enterprises were managed. He also operated a bar, Gefkin's, a flower shop, a restaurant, and a taxi stand. But behind the facade of legitimate enterprise was the pulsing engine of the underground: theft, gambling, loans, hijackings, and more. The 1960s and 1970s marked the peak of Vario's power. In the mid-1960s, after the death of Jake Colombo, Vario moved to take control of illegal gambling operations in Long Island's Cedarhurst and Inwood sections. Arrests followed. In February 1966 he was charged in Brooklyn federal court for controlling a gambling ring, and months later Nassau County arrested him again for bookmaking. But despite the legal pressure, his standing within the family and his empire remained strong. By 1972, law enforcement's focus on Vario had sharpened. The FBI and other agencies planted listening devices and bugged his trailer at the junkyard, recorded conversations, monitored his men. In November of that year he was indicted on charges of insurance fraud for sinking a boat and filing a claim, on tampering with a witness and bribery. The surveillance prompted heists, raids, car chases and indictments. His trailer became a hub of criminal planning and law enforcement infiltration. In 1973 he was convicted on tax evasion charges and sentenced to 6 years. While incarcerated at the federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, he was placed among the Mafia Rao prisoners. Even behind bars he remained a figure of consequence. Upon release from prison in 1975, Vario resumed his role, albeit in altered form. He relocated to Florida for a time on parole, but maintained ties to his crew and to his operations. His standing within the Lucchese family however had shifted. New leadership under Anthony Corallo replaced him with Salvatore Santoro as his formal successor. The nature of the underworld was changing, and Vario sensed it. One of the most famous episodes tied to Vario and his crew is the infamous Lufthansa heist at JFK in 1978, in which approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry in 1978 dollars were stolen from the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Vario may not have physically carried out the heist, but as capo he approved it, gave orders, signed off the crew's involvement, and held a measure of accountability for what transpired. Many of the men involved were part of his circle or operated under his backing. The aftermath of the heist, however, brought complications. Missteps were made. A getaway car was abandoned with fingerprints. The quiet world of the shadows became noisy with law enforcement inquiries, mob paranoia and internal suspicion. Associates were quietly murdered to cover tracks. The fear of one slip gradually turned into full legal exposure. Vario understood the stakes, but the net was tightening. In parallel to these criminal achievements, Vario ran his operation with a dual nature. On the one hand, publicly he might claim to be a florist, a taxi stand operator, a bar owner. On the other hand, he was a feared and respected figure inside the mob world, whose crews moved tons of stolen goods, hijacked cargo, extorted labor and enforced silence. He avoided the limelight but commanded power. His relationship with younger men and protégé figures was central. One of the most infamous among those was Henry Hill, the associate whose story would later become famous in book and film, and who would ultimately help bring down the very structure he once served. Hill worked for Vario, carried out errands, obeyed orders, but the loyalty that the underworld demanded was brittle and easily broken. In the early 1980s, events started moving rapidly. Hill was arrested in 1980 for drug trafficking, and during the course of his incarceration the law played recordings back to him of conversations about killing him. Realizing his own position was irreversibly compromised, Hill turned informant. His testimony would prove pivotal in indicting senior figures including Vario. On February 9, 1984, Vario was convicted of defrauding the federal government. The testimony of his former associate Henry Hill helped establish that Vario had arranged a fictitious restaurant job for Hill so that Hill could be released from prison. Vario was sentenced on April 3 to 4 years in federal prison and fined $10,000. Then on February 21, 1985, while still serving his sentence, Vario was indicted on racketeering and extortion charges relating to over $350,000 of payments from air cargo companies at JFK Airport, threatened with labor problems if they didn't pay off. He was convicted and handed a 10-year prison term. Vario's health, already declining, would never recover in prison. On May 3, 1988, he died behind bars at the federal prison in Fort Worth, Texas, aged 73, of respiratory failure due to lung disease. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York. While the criminal world he inhabited has changed drastically over the decades, the legacy of Paul Vario persists, notably through popular culture. In the 1990 film Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese, Vario's story is fictionalized via the character, Paulie Cicero, played by the actor Paul Sorvino. This character captures both the stoic outward persona and the ruthless under-the-surface pragmatism of its real-life model. In that portrayal, Paulie appears as a wise, calm head of a crew, but the historical record suggests that the real Paul Vario was more volatile than the Hollywood version, more instinctive, quicker to anger, more hands-on, and more grounded in the rougher side of the rackets than the suavely effete figure on screen. The legend sanitizes some of the rough edges but the essence remains. A man who built power from the streets, wielded it, and ultimately lost it. His rise and fall provide a microcosm of the American organized crime story of the mid-20th century. Immigrant neighborhoods, tight-knit ethnic ties, post-war opportunity and corruption, union infiltration, federal law enforcement escalation, criminal adaptation, betrayal and collapse. Through those decades the structures changed, but the themes of ambition, loyalty, fear and retribution remained constant. Vario's story reflects that arc. It is important to reflect on his forgotten status. While many mob figures of his era have become household names, the Gottis, the Genoveses, the Gambinos, Vario remains less widely known outside those who dig deeply into mob history or gangster film aficionados. Yet his influence was substantial. He operated at a level of authority where his decisions determined who lived or died, whose cargo got hijacked, whose union was squeezed, and whose silence was bought or enforced. He is a figure who did not seek the spotlight, but commanded power nonetheless. Perhaps that is why he is forgotten, in popular parlance even as the structures he helped build remain visible in lore. When we examine the specifics of his operation, we see both cunning and brutality. He did not invent the hijacking or the extortion racket at airports, but under his watch, the network at JFK became a well-oiled machine. He understood the pieces needed: the dock workers, the union contacts, the freight companies, the threat of work stoppage, the calculation of risk versus reward. He inserted himself into the machinery of legitimate commerce, cargo, freight, labor, and overlaid the underworld network of pressure and payoff. In one sense, the racket looked like legitimate business. Who can complain when the cargo arrives on time? But underneath, the price was coercion. He also understood that money needed laundering. The legitimate fronts, auto parts, taxi stands, bars, served to absorb the ill-gotten gains and gave a veneer of respectability. The old adage, "never put your name on anything," wasn't just about legal exposure, it was about maintaining plausible deniability, letting others carry the heat while he stayed in the shadows. The younger men did the jobs, got arrested occasionally, took the risks. He positioned himself to survive long enough to delegate. Yet in spite of that, even he could not evade the long arm of law enforcement forever. And so the wheels of his downfall were as much human as mechanical. Henry Hill's betrayal was the turning point. When a man who lived the life for years realized that even his loyalty offered no shield, he flipped. And once one man flips, the dominoes begin to fall. Vario's conviction for defrauding the government and later the extortion charges did not spring from a dramatic bust of a massive heist. They came from years of surveillance, wiretaps, recordings, the FBI moving into the trailer at the junkyard, following the paper trail, watching men talk. The underworld had changed. Big money was there, but so was big surveillance and big risk. In prison, Vario was stripped of his freedom, his power diminished, his health failing. The man who had controlled men, cargo and crews ended his days dependent on the mercies of prison wardens and medical system. There is a starkness in that descent, from power in the streets of Brooklyn to a bed in a cell at Fort Worth, Texas. He died on May 3, 1988. That day closed the chapter of a man who once seemed invincible. His life invites reflection on the nature of power, loyalty and violence. He manipulated labor, crime and fear. He built alliances and destroyed them. He trusted few but demanded obedience. He rewarded loyalty and punished defiance. But in the end, the same logic that built his empire also dismantled it. In the world he inhabited, there was no immunity, only degrees of exposure, and eventually, the walls closed in. Thus, when we speak of Paul Vario, the forgotten Goodfellas Godfather, as one might call him, we remember a figure whose legacy lives partly in the iconography of gangster cinema and partly in the hidden archive of organized crime investigations. He was the model for the movie boss, the quiet architect of mayhem, the man behind the scenes who seldom sought fame but always commanded respect. He may not have the glitter of the front-page family name, but his reach was long, and his story remains instructive. In the end, his footprint is not merely the crimes he ordered or the money he extorted. It lies in the system he helped maintain, the structure of exploitation and influence that stretched from broken neighborhoods to international airports, from street corners in Brooklyn to cargo holds at JFK. And for that reason, when one watches Goodfellas and sees Paulie Cicero seated calmly at the head of the table, one is witnessing not just a fictional boss, but the ghost of Paul Vario's world. And perhaps that is his true legacy. Neither the most glamorous gangster, nor the most notorious, but the one who kept the machine running, quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly. He reminded the world that power often resides not in the spotlight, but in the done deal, the whispered threat, the handshake after the raid, the back door at midnight. He lived that life, and he died it, behind bars, far from the clubhouse, far from the streets he once ruled. His story is a cautionary tale. Ambition unchecked, loyalty misplaced, violence institutionalized, and ultimately, the consequences inescapable.